Most money problems don't actually start with money, they start with how you see yourself, and the quiet story you've been telling in your head for years without even realizing it. I used to think money problems were about math. Spend less than you earn, save consistently, invest over time, that's it, right? Simple. But then I started noticing something strange. Two people could earn the same amount, live in the same city, even have the same opportunities, and still end up in completely different financial situations. One slowly builds stability, the other keeps starting over. And it's not because one is smarter, or more disciplined, or even more motivated. If anything, both are trying equally hard. So what's actually going on? The uncomfortable truth is that most people don't have a money problem. What they have is an identity problem that quietly shapes every financial decision they make. Because whether you realize it or not, you don't just manage money, you act in alignment with who you believe you are. And that belief runs deeper than logic. Think about this for a second. If someone deep down believes, I'm just bad with money, what do you think happens when they finally start saving? At first, things might go well. They cut back a little, maybe build up $500, maybe even $1,000. On the surface, everything looks like progress. But internally, something feels off. That growing balance doesn't match their identity. So what happens next is subtle, almost invisible. They justify a purchase. Something necessary. Something deserved. Something that just happens to bring that balance right back down. Not because they're irresponsible, but because staying broke feels familiar. It feels like them. Now compare that to someone who sees themselves as careful with money. They don't need extreme discipline. They don't need to fight themselves every day. Their choices naturally align with that identity. They hesitate before spending. They think long-term without forcing it. Saving isn't a struggle, it's just consistent. And this is where most financial advice quietly breaks down. Because it assumes people act based on knowledge. But in reality, people act based on identity. You can understand budgeting, investing, and saving at a high level, and still behave in ways that completely contradict that knowledge. Not because you don't get it, but because it doesn't feel like you. Let me make this more real. Imagine someone named Chris. Chris grew up in a household where money was always tight. Bills were stressful, conversations about money were tense, and stability always felt temporary. Over time, Chris didn't just observe this, he absorbed it. Without anyone saying it directly, he formed an identity: money doesn't stay. It comes and goes. Now fast forward to adulthood. Chris gets a decent job. Starts earning more than he ever saw growing up. For the first time, there's real potential to build something stable. But something strange happens. Every time things start to improve, something pulls him back. He spends a little more than he planned. Not recklessly, just enough to keep things unstable. He avoids checking his bank account sometimes, even though he knows he should. He delays investing, telling himself he'll figure it out later. And from the outside, it looks like a discipline problem. But internally, it's something else entirely. Stability feels unfamiliar to Chris. And humans, whether they realize it or not, are wired to return to what feels familiar, even if it's not what's best for them. Now let's flip the scenario. Take someone named Lisa. Lisa didn't grow up rich, but she grew up with consistency. Bills got paid. There wasn't excess, but there also wasn't chaos. So Lisa's identity becomes something like, money needs to be managed. It's not emotional. It's not stressful. It's just something you handle. Now when Lisa starts earning, she doesn't feel the same internal friction. Saving feels normal. Planning feels expected. She's not necessarily more knowledgeable than Chris, but her identity isn't fighting her behavior. And that's the difference most people miss. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Identity doesn't just affect how you manage money, it affects what you believe is possible for you. If someone sees themselves as the type of person who struggles, they unconsciously make decisions that reinforce that story. They might avoid opportunities because they don't feel ready. They might underprice their work because charging more feels uncomfortable. They might stay in situations that limit them because growth feels uncertain. Not because they lack ability, but because stepping into something bigger would require becoming someone different. And that's uncomfortable. So instead, they stay consistent with who they've always been. There's a subtle pattern you start to notice when you look at money through this lens. People don't rise to the level of their financial goals. They fall back to the level of their financial identity. That's why someone can say, I want to save $10,000 this year, and still end up with nothing saved. Because wanting something and identifying with it are two completely different things. One is a goal. The other is a belief. And belief always wins. Let's talk about Ben for a second. Ben tells himself he wants to be financially stable. He watches videos, reads about investing, maybe even creates a plan. But deep down, Ben still sees himself as someone who figures things out last minute. So what happens? He procrastinates on setting up his accounts. He delays starting because he wants everything to be perfect. He tells himself he'll get serious next month. And months turn into years. Not because Ben is lazy, but because his behavior is consistent with his identity. Last-minute Ben can't become consistent investor Ben overnight. That shift isn't about strategy. It's about identity. And this is where things can feel frustrating. Because it means solving money problems isn't just about doing different things, it's about becoming a slightly different version of yourself. Not dramatically different. Not some extreme transformation. Just someone who sees money differently. If you've ever felt like you keep repeating the same financial patterns, even when you know better, this might be why. It's not a lack of effort. It's not a lack of information. It's a mismatch between who you're trying to be and who you believe you are. And that mismatch creates friction. The shift starts when you realize something simple but powerful. You don't need to force better financial habits, you need to make them feel like they belong to you. Because once something becomes part of your identity, it stops feeling like effort. It becomes automatic. Instead of saying, I need to save more, the shift is subtle. I'm someone who keeps a margin. Instead of, I should stop overspending, it becomes, I'm someone who thinks before I spend. Instead of chasing big financial goals that feel distant, you start reinforcing small identity-based actions that feel real. And over time, those actions stack. Let's go back to Chris. The version of Chris who struggles with money isn't going to suddenly become perfect with finances. But he can start becoming the kind of person who pays attention. That's it. Not perfect. Not extreme. Just aware. He checks his account regularly. He notices his spending patterns. He starts making slightly more intentional decisions. And at first, it doesn't feel natural. But over time, something changes. Awareness becomes normal. Then consistency becomes normal. Then stability starts to feel familiar. And once stability feels familiar, everything shifts. This is the part most people skip. They try to change outcomes without changing identity. But outcomes are just a reflection of consistent behavior, and behavior is a reflection of identity. If you enjoy thinking about money in this deeper, more human way, you'll probably find the rest of these conversations just as useful. So what do you actually do with this? It's not about reinventing yourself overnight. It's about making small shifts that gradually change how you see yourself. Start by paying attention to the language you use internally. Not out loud, but in your head. When something goes wrong financially, do you say, I always mess this up? Or do you say, that wasn't a great decision? One reinforces identity. The other isolates behavior. That difference matters more than it seems. Then look at your patterns without judgment. Not to criticize yourself, but to understand what feels familiar. Do you tend to spend when you're stressed? Do you avoid looking at your finances when things feel uncertain? Do you delay decisions until they become urgent? These aren't flaws. They're clues. They tell you what identity you've been operating from. From there, focus on small actions that align with a slightly different version of you. Not a perfect version. Just a more stable one. If you've never saved consistently, don't aim for large amounts. Start with something that feels almost too easy. Because the goal isn't the amount. It's reinforcing the identity of someone who saves. If investing feels overwhelming, don't try to master everything at once. Start by learning just enough to feel comfortable taking the first step. Because once you see yourself as someone who invests, even at a small level, your behavior starts to shift naturally. And maybe most importantly, give it time. Identity doesn't change in a moment. It changes through repetition. Through small, consistent actions that slowly feel less forced and more natural. At the end of the day, money is rarely just about numbers. It's about comfort, familiarity, and the quiet stories you've been carrying for years. The way you spend, save, avoid, or plan, it all makes sense when you look at it through the lens of identity. Not as a flaw, but as a pattern. And patterns can change. Not instantly. Not perfectly. But gradually, in a way that actually lasts. So if things haven't been working the way you hoped, it might not be because you're doing everything wrong. It might just be that you're trying to build a new financial life, on top of an old identity. And once you start shifting that identity, even slightly, the decisions that used to feel difficult start to feel normal. And that's when real change begins. If this way of thinking resonates with you, you'll probably find yourself coming back to these ideas more often than you expect. Because once you see money this way, it's hard to unsee it.